Hello, everybody. Welcome to Nature Source Care. My name is Dr. Funda Goldman. I'm a naturopathic physician. And today I was going to talk about the Bach Flower remedy, Centaury. Bach Flower remedies, if you're not familiar, are a type of homeopathy or energy medicine. And this particular remedy is, funny enough, for the inability to say no. So let's take a look. A few notes beforehand. The information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For any symptoms that persist or worsen, please consult with a qualified medical professional. It's always best to determine the root cause of any disease and to develop a comprehensive treatment plan. And while homeopathy Bach flower remedies can be very effective, they may not be appropriate for everyone or as a single therapy, so please keep that in mind. Okay, so just a few words about Bach flower remedies and homeopathy before we get into Centaury specifically. So Bach flower remedies are kind of homeopathy, which is a greater umbrella of what we call energy medicine. And in my first Bach flower remedy video on Walnut New Beginnings, I get into more of the background and history, okay? But the general idea of these remedies is that a disease stems from an inner struggle, okay? So I find that these Bach flower remedies are particularly helpful with mental, emotional, and spiritual type of issues people are having. And if you want more content like this, check out my videos in my Bach flower remedy and homeopathy playlist, okay? So for Centaury specifically, the keynote that we're looking for, that we identify in people to make us think, maybe they're in a Centaury state, is that they tend to prioritize others' desires over their own, almost to a fault, right? And so it seems like from this outer expression of the symptoms, we gather that they're on the inner state of being, regarding the inner state of being, is that there's a lack of a strong relationship with one's personal will. Okay. So now let's look at some other symptoms you might see or identify in somebody or yourself. So Centaury people, for the most part, are very good-natured, pleasant, quote unquote, nice people. Okay. And maybe again, to their own detriment, they tend to be also responsive to praise and criticism. And because of that, they can be easily taken advantage by others. So they're very amenable. Okay. And they're not the problem child typically. Actually, they almost never cause a problem because they're somewhat conflict averse. Okay. And so what happens is that they can not proceed in pursuing their own dreams because they're caretaking or, fulfilling the desires of other people. Okay. Um, and then sometimes even like what they'll do is like they'll rather than do even for themselves, like if they're in a job or something like that, they might choose a job or position because of what others want, not what they want. So like maybe their parents, for example, want them to be XYZ, and so they become XYZ, even though for themselves, it's not really a burning desire for them in any way. Okay, or maybe somebody else, maybe like an influential teacher or something like that, or maybe a spouse or something like that. Okay. So, yeah, what else? So in general, they tend to be more of a servant, type of personality, or it seems like that, or energy, rather than like, a boss or leadership type. Okay. Um, and with that, it can be like, again, they have a hard time setting boundaries. So regarding work, like on a personal level, like at home, maybe if they have a more dominant spouse, or in the workplace, if they have dominant, coworker, not even boss, but coworkers, they might find themselves using all their time to support these other people. And the other thing is, they might get requests for help, off hours from work, or, like on the weekend or late at night or whatever. And, they'll be responsive, and usually pretty quickly. So this means that like, they don't have much of their own schedule anymore. Their schedule is based on what other people are demanding or asking or requesting from them. So, they also potentially have the ability to anticipate the wishes of others before they even ask. So maybe they know the habits or, preferences of somebody, and they kind of, you know, fulfill those wishes even before somebody asks. And again, throughout this whole process, they're essentially suppressing their own needs and desires. The other thing is they may not be very clear on their own needs and desires because they're so externally focused on fulfilling other people's wants and needs. Okay. So the other thing is, again, when this gets out of hand and out of balance, essentially, these people might be seen as a doormat, or in sort of a more polished, version, is like basically a martyr. They're sacrificing themselves for the sake of others. Okay. Or they kind of, again, can't say no to anybody, small or big, or, impossible requests. So the thing is, like, they will complain of being tired and overworked, but they typically don't experience like a deeper level of, you know, uh, distress. Like, they won't be like, oh, my boss is being unfair, blah, blah, blah. They're just like, I'm tired, because I'm trying to keep up with what my boss keeps giving me. And they don't really question what their boss is giving them, or what their coworker, maybe the coworkers are like offloading their own, to-do list onto their desk, and like, having this person, pick up, or help them with what their tasks are, that sort of thing. Or maybe it's family members who, again, they just know whenever they call, this person's going to drop everything and immediately come running and help them out, and this and that. Okay. So this person is basically, again, not really focusing on their own path, their own journey, their own mission in life. Okay. And again, they don't tend to complain. Again, there's no real distress here, except they're just like, oh, I'm just tired. I was up at 3 o'clock helping out, my wife, or my child, or my grown child, not just like a baby, who needs help sometimes in the middle of the night. But, you're getting the point, hopefully. Okay. And so the other thing that's problematic is that they're not really recognizing the long-term or deeper side effects of, them behaving this way. And they may even justify why they're, continually, helping other people out, at their own, to their own detriment, that sort of thing. So part of this may be due to, um, like, kind of a more deeper need for recognition and validation. And again, this may not be like, they're given an award or a trophy, or anything where they're sort of like, recognized in a big way. It might be more subtle than that. Like, maybe they just, they feel like, there's lack of conflict with coworkers or bosses or family members or whatever. And that's, and they feel sort of included or needed on some level. Okay. So that's a possibility. But the other thing is that, there might be that motivation, but there also might be like the deeper kind of issues of not really valuing themselves, like not really valuing their own desires, not really valuing, taking the time to figure out what their desires are, or what their mission is. Um, they might be hiding actually from self-responsibility. It's a possibility. And then again, this often includes just a general lack of boundaries. And some of this also may be generated from like, childhood traumas and stuff like that, especially if they had adults in their life, like parents who, were constantly, crossing their boundaries. They may not even recognize that people are constantly, crossing their boundaries, if that's what they're used to. Okay. And the other thing is that maybe, them not pushing back and just being kind of subservient to others was a survival mechanism, in childhood. If maybe there was domestic violence or abuse at home, of self or others, that sort of thing. Just staying under the radar. So the other thing is that this can be like more of a temporary state, especially when somebody's in the midst of developing new skills. So, for example, like maybe there's a student and a teacher, and the student is constantly asking for feedback and trying to like make the teacher happy and proud and that sort of thing. But that's the thing is, like, for any, true teacher, they're actually looking for the time, the point where the student is strong enough and confident within themselves that they can actually challenge the teacher. Okay. Now, some teachers, they want the student, which is kind of a twisted, version of this. Some teachers want their students to be subservient, and they kind of, derive something from that. But again, a true teacher wants their students to be independent and, shine and do good things in the world. And the same with parents. Again, most parents at some point, and this is a common and typical, point of personal development, is that at some point, usually in the kind of the later, mid to later teenage years, as a child's becoming more independent, teenagers get a bad rap for being rebellious, but they're supposed to be rebellious. At some point, they're supposed to push back on what the parents think and say and how the parents do things because they're developing themselves. They're developing their own mind, they're developing their own habits, they're developing their own preferences, they're developing their own values. So that's generally a good sign. I mean, it may not be happy or pleasant for the parents who's used to a very compliant, a kid, but in terms of the child development into a teenager and independent adult is actually very important and crucial. And so again, healthy parent-child relationship will, encourage that, look forward to that. Whereas other parents who might prefer to be dominant over their children will maybe try to squash that in their kid. Okay. So, what's a risk here if somebody doesn't address these sorts of issues? Well, they won't maybe even recognize what their life mission is, and therefore, and also not focus on it because they're helping out everybody else. So they'll fail to accomplish their life mission. And over time, this may reinforce like a negative self-image of like, oh, I'm not as good as others, or my wishes aren't as important as others, and that sort of thing. And also, like, again, it kind of can keep them in this more immature and codependent state where they're not fully realized as a human being. Okay. So the potential outcome for taking a remedy such as Centaury is that they will actually know what they want, know what their desires and wants and preferences and values are, and they will follow them and pursue them. But again, in a way that balances, and not so much that they become completely self-centered or self-absorbed, but where they can balance, their wants and desires with those of others. And then there's actually like a clarity or even conviction of self-worth and one's life direction. And then there will be devotional service to others, but like in a wise way where it's not, a deficit to yourself. Okay. They'll also take more responsibility for themselves and become self-empowered. Okay. So, as always, when I talk about Bach Flower remedies, I mentioned that, the real trick here, with these Bach Flower remedies is to really understand the subtleties of somebody's deeper motivations and to match it with a remedy and to know the subtleties of the different remedies. Okay. So by this time, I've done most of the Bach flowers. So these are some of the other Bach flowers you might consider if you're thinking about something like Centaury as a remedy for yourself or somebody else. Okay, and you can see where, again, there's some overlap here. So again, choosing the best one, is really, how you're going to help yourself or somebody else the most. All right, so there's aspen. Aspen is for fear, but vague fears that you can't really identify, which may be true. And they tend to be kind of overly sensitive and impressionable because they're always kind of they're almost like a hypervigilant type. Okay. So maybe some of this responsiveness is potentially. Okay. Cerato is for not trusting one's intuition. So it's not really about, which is different. So there's intuition there and like some sort of drive forward in certain directions in life, but one's not really trusting it, as opposed to somebody who's so like disconnected from self that they don't like if you ask them what would you like to do, like they usually sort of like get stumped like, oh, I don't know, like they don't even think about it or consider it, like it's not even like in their mind what they'd like to do with their time and energy. Then there's chestnut bud. This one is for people who don't learn from their mistakes. So, maybe the problem is, in general, and even like when it doesn't have to do with other people, and maybe learning that other people don't have, the greatest and most beneficial motives for asking for help. They're just, essentially using the person who's, being considered at this time. Even within themselves, like maybe they go and they keep buying the same kind of item, like a shirt that's like doesn't work for them or doesn't work for their lifestyles, like the wrong color size or whatever, and they keep doing that. So even when other people aren't involved, this is somebody who like doesn't really like learn from their mistakes. So maybe in that case, chestnut bud might be, the better remedy. Then I have a whole video on elm, hornbeam, oak, and olive. Now all these remedies are similar because they all deal with someone who's overwhelmed and burnt out. So maybe the thing is like, if somebody's overwhelmed and burnt out, that's why that's why they're complaining. Like maybe it's just like simply too much. And it's not a matter of them um helping people too much, but like literally just the demand at in a certain time in certain times of their life or professionally or whatever are just too much for anybody to handle, even if it's like an appropriate ask. Then there's Heather. So Heather is for what we call the needy child, and this is for somebody who they usually are more talkers, and they tend to get attention from people, but it's like coming from this place of like maybe they didn't get enough attention as a child or something like that. So maybe again, like this need to be needed is, again, somewhat related to them staying in more of like a immature, adolescent, juvenile state of mind and relationship dynamic with others. So that's a possibility. Then there's Larch. Larch is for, lack of confidence, basically because somebody has an inferiority complex. So they do actually believe that they're not as good as other people. And so they won't give them a chance to give themselves a chance to like, reach for a better job or higher paying job or be put in a position of leadership or management or something like this. They'll always like, uh, you know, uh, take themselves out of the game, before the game's over, before they have a chance to win the game, that sort of thing. Then there's Pine. Pine is for when people like are really in a state of condemnation for something that they've done. Like they're basically not forgiving their past mistakes. And because they're not forgiving themselves for past mistakes, they're kind of not allowing themselves to progress forward and try for things because they feel like they don't deserve it. Not because they're inferior, like the large person, but because they've made a mistake that's like unforgivable or something like that, and they deserve to, again, not do well or be punished or something along those lines. Then there's Walnut. Walnut is for, transitions in life. And sometimes people have resistance to transitions because there's some level of fear. And so it might be that the reason why people are helping others so much is because that they're afraid of transitioning into like more of a self-supported role, independent role, or maybe even like somebody in a leadership role who like the dynamic shifts from being kind of subservient to someone who's sort of calling the shots and asking other people, delegating tasks to people and getting the whole, kind of leading the group. Okay. So that's a possibility. Then there's a white chestnut. This is mostly for like repetitive thoughts. So again, this might be somebody who, again, is sort of in a loop mentally, and ma- can't really figure out or decide what their life mission is. And so because they're sort of stuck, while they're stuck in themselves in their head, they might as well like help other people or distract themselves from these repetitive thoughts that aren't productive by helping people. So again, it's like the subtleties here are what, really make a difference. And another one to consider is wild oak. So this is somebody who's sort of like here, there, and everywhere, and it's not, again, clear on their, life purpose. And because of that, they can't sort of organize themselves in one particular direction, and so again, they might be sort of like, well, I don't really know what I'm doing, or I'm sort of doing this for a few weeks and then doing this for a few weeks or whatever. And I'm sort of all over the place. So maybe they sort of, it's not that they have a purpose, but at least they're doing something that's productive by helping other people instead of figuring out what their purpose is or getting clarity on that. Okay. So again, I have videos on all these remedies, so you might consider some of these as well. Okay, so thanks so much for stopping by, listening to one of my talks. I appreciate all the support you give my work and the channel. I do have a couple books on Amazon that are available. You can follow the link here if you're interested in those resources. I also have an online photography gallery and gift shop, so you might find some interesting prints or gifts for yourself or other people there. And there's the link also. And I do have another YouTube channel where I talk about Vedic astrology or the astrology of ancient India. Um, I have sorts of like, transit and interpretation videos as well as teaching videos on that if that's interesting to you. The name of that channel is Light Vedic Astrology. So yeah, I hope you found this talk helpful and interesting to you. And that as always, it helps you and those around you. All right. So take good care until the next one.